The American Meteorological Society's policy program is supported, in part, by a public-private partnership.
We can't afford to continue building and rebuilding the way we have. We've rebuilt things too many times. We have to rebuild them in a way that they're going to stay in place for a while.
Bill Nechamen is the State Floodplain Management Coordinator for the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. He provides training, technical assistance, and program review for local communities and their residents with respect to meeting floodplain management standards. He is also the chair of the Association of State Floodplain Managers and a founding member of the New York State Floodplain and Stormwater Managers Association.
Thank you. And let me see if we can get this started. Here we go. And for those of you who haven't been to the Great Northeast, New York is a place that is full of mountains, woods, lakes, rushing rivers, farms, beaches, and a large town down in the corner. I had a different slide at one time that I've used in other presentations, which showed 100-year floods somewhere in New York every year since 1999, when North Carolina sent Floyd up our way when they were done with it. Well, we have. Some place in the state has had 100-year floods every year for at least the past 15 years. But then we got hammered. So in June 2006, we had, it wasn't a tropical storm, it was a tropical system, kind of a river of atmospheric water that came up from the south and hit central New York and inundated the Delaware, Susquehanna, and Mohawk River basins. After we're done with the Delaware and Susquehanna, we then send them down to Pennsylvania to deal with. I thought that was going to be the flood of my career. I was wrong. In spring of 2011, we had a large snow cover up in the Adirondack Mountains and Vermont's Green Mountains. It all ran off in a short time with a lot of rain. We had record floods in northern New York and the headwater areas of the Hudson River. Lake Champlain hit the highest elevations in the history of gauging on the lake, at least since white people have been keeping records there. I thought that was going to be a big deal, and we'd be working on it for quite a while. And then Irene came. Irene made us forget about Lake Champlain and forget about the North Country. Irene exceeded 500-year flood levels in some areas of the upper Hudson, Schoharie. The Schoharie flows north into the Mohawk, which then flows east to the Hudson. And again, the Lake Champlain tributaries up in the Adirondack Mountains. Irene was followed a week and a half later by Lee. And when that came, I started referring to it as the revenge of General Lee, but a friend of mine from Mississippi said General Lee would have never done that. So Lee came and poured a lot of water into already saturated land. And the record Susquehanna River floods in 2006 were exceeded and levees overtopped by the floods that resulted from Lee. This photo, that's my friend Tom Blanchard and colleague. This is the Schoharie County Planning Director, Shane Nickel. I took the slide and I realized that I did not edit the template, so I apologize for that. But this is Main Street in the village of Schoharie. Schoharie is a mostly rural village about 30 miles southwest of Albany. This was the flood elevation on Main Street. This is the flood map, and this is a little hard to see. This blue line outlines that structure or that property, and there's a little hole in there. Now, this pink area is the 500-year flood zone. There's a little hole there which is higher than the 500-year flood elevation, and at that location, that was the flood level from Irene. And this shows meteorologically Irene's path of destruction as it moved up from the south up into New York. We were expecting a bad coastal storm from that, and it really didn't hit the coastline very hard, but really hit hard inland in the river systems, and then went up into northern New England, and Vermont got hit pretty bad as well. This shows the darker the red and purple tone, the more severe the flooding in the particular basin. So you can see some purple areas. This is the Adirondack Mountains up here with flood flows of 200 to 500-year levels. Here's a couple of basins up here, again in the Adirondacks, and down here in the Catskill Mountains with larger than 500-year flood flows. The headwaters of the Schoharie Creek is up in this area, and the mountains form a bit of a bowl that when the winds hit it just right, you have the uplift and the water just pours out. In this area, they recorded 18 inches of rain within a 24-hour period. And this shows the precipitation from Lee. Had we not had Irene, it probably wouldn't have been as severe, but the ground was already saturated, couldn't hold any more water. So as Lee came up through central Pennsylvania and into the southern tier of New York, this area got hit hard and then down through the Susquehanna Basin. And this shows some of the flood flows for Lee. Again, down in this area, you saw these purple areas. These watersheds got greater than 200-year flood flows. So our governor said, gee, 100-year floods seem to be happening every year, and he was right. So what do we do about it? Well, there's a lot going on. Local municipalities have to take the lead in terms of rebuilding in floodplains. New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, we help coordinate the floodplain management response. We're also involved in flood protection. We manage levee and flood control works in the state. We have a dam safety program. We're monitoring wastewater treatment plants and water filtration plants and other critical infrastructure. The New York State Department of State takes the lead on community planning. New York State Office of Emergency Management, emergency response. They handle the FEMA mitigation programs. New York State Department of Housing and Economic Development, they handle the HUD Community Development Block Grant programs. And of course, on the federal level, and I forgot to put in the Corps of Engineers and how essential they were in all this, but FEMA, HUD, NOAA, the Corps, so many agencies involved, so many programs involved. Some people do refer to that as the post-disaster disaster. But we've learned a lot. We've had a lot of experience, so we try to do a little better every time. What the governor did is he put together a New York State Office of Storm Recovery to try to coordinate all these programs. So, and there was all the Sandy recovery money. Within that legislation was the ability to spend some of these dollars on communities that were hit by Irene and Lee, as well as Sandy. After Irene and Lee, I was hoping that we'd get a year without a severe flood. They gave me 13 months, and then Sandy hit. So there are 4 core programs in the New York State Office of Storm Recovery. There's a housing recovery program. They're doing a lot of building elevations, a lot of buyouts. They're required to elevate where they are elevating to the base flood elevation plus 2 feet, which is in our New York State building code for residential structures need to be at least 2 feet higher than the base flood elevation. There are programs for small business. There's a community reconstruction program and an infrastructure program. So I'm going to focus briefly on the community reconstruction program. That was a competitive program. They offered $25 million total in planning grants to 124 communities. And a community might have been a neighborhood. For instance, there were some neighborhoods in New York City that were communities for the sake of this program. And that must include public engagement, asset inventory, risk assessment, and so forth, and to come up with a plan. And the governor wanted the plans to come from the bottom up. So there were meetings at the local level in which local folks would talk about, well, what do we need to develop a more resilient community? Based on these plans, there's between $3 and $25 million available for communities for implementation. Now with that, I want to focus on one of the plans that I think is one of the more innovative. It's a village of Sidney. Sidney is on the Susquehanna River. Here's the river coming down, Interstate 88, which runs between Albany and Binghamton. Kind of parallels the river in this area. Binghamton is down here, Albany is up here, New York City is down here somewhere. So it kind of gives you perspective of where that is, these colored areas are the villages, some of the populated places. And this was the second time they got hit. They got hit hard in 2006. They figured, let's rebuild, and we'll never see this again. And then they saw it again, just a few years later. So this is the village of Sidney. These are the high hazard areas, the moderate hazard areas based on the FEMA flood maps. And what they decided to do in Sidney is take a look at this neighborhood, which was hit very hard, and actually relocate it. They found an area just outside the village on high land. They're going to annex this territory into the village and build a community up here. Part of it will be suburban, part of it will be urban. They mean it to be walkable with community services. So some of the things they intend to do, create a new neighborhood on 165 acres, about $1.3 million for that, extend municipal infrastructure, buy out properties, at-risk properties, and give them assistance for relocation, develop community-based housing, develop community facilities, develop a green energy solar microgrid and green building standards, and develop a community recreation and flood storage area on those flood-prone lands in which they're buying structures out. So on this green plain is what they're calling it, passive recreation, something kind of unique that they're calling an edible forest, where school groups can go through and find things that are edible within the forest. A lot of environmental education, wetland walks, picnic areas, active recreation and entertainment area, an outdoor entertainment area, a history and environmental education center. And I'm really looking forward to being able to do a tour there in a few years. So another step that New York took, last year in September, the governor signed the New York State Community Risk and Resiliency Act. What that law does a lot of things. One of the things that it does is it tells the state of New York that we have to come up with a sea level rise projection. We realize that the projections are, there's a range, and there's a certain probability rating to the range, and the range changes depending on how far into the future you go, and the uncertainty increases as you go far into the future. But we're required to come up with a goal for planning purposes and development purposes by next January 1st. So we're working on that now. There is a New York State Smart Growth Public Infrastructure Program, and that sea level rise projection is supposed to be tied into that. It tells us we have to develop model local laws to enhance resiliency. It tells us that we have to consider sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding in a number of state permit and grant programs. And it tells us we have to do all this by January 1st, 2017. My agency, DEC, and the New York State Department of State are taking the lead on it and trying to develop these standards. We're looking forward to the Technical Mapping Advisory Committee guidance and sea level rise to kind of assist us with that. And the new federal flood risk management standard, which is currently in review, really ties into that closely. We feel that the federal goals to build to a higher risk and the state goals to build in a way that's resilient to a higher risk really help each other. We can't afford to continue building and rebuilding the way we have. We've rebuilt things too many times. We have to rebuild them in a way that they're going to stay in place for a while. I want to echo what Seal said about flood maps. So she had her map, I've got my map. We did not coordinate on this. So these red areas are the parts of New York State that have modernized digital flood maps. Doesn't mean it has up-to-date flood studies, because a lot of these mapped areas, they took an old study that might have been 30 years old and just plotted it on a new digital platform. So we have a lot of needs for flood map upgrades. The yellow areas, and this is the Adirondack Mountains, so granted a lot of it's fairly rural, but there are flood-prone communities out there. The southern tier of New York, this is very flood prone, and again, it's relatively rural compared to this area, but there's still a lot of flood prone communities there. These people are still relying on old paper maps. Some of them were drawn by hand in the 1970s, just tracing USGS topographic maps. They are thoroughly insufficient for flood risk reduction planning. So we need updated flood maps. The flood risk is changing. We can't plan based on 30 or 40-year-old studies. And flood studies, frankly, are not inexpensive. There's a lot of new technologies that John talked about that really helps, but you still have to do the engineering analysis. ASFPM, am I out of town? Okay. ASFPM has put together a flood mapping for the nation report that talks about what the flood mapping need is for the nation. So there is a sign up on the table outside if you want to get a copy of that report. There we go. Thank you.